Has the United Kingdom changed its mind about Brexit? Is the country as divided as ever? Are you sick of politicians claiming to know what the country voted for back in 2016 or what it wants now? Tonight, hard Brexit, soft Brexit, slow Brexit or no Brexit? We discover what the nation really thinks. Good evening from Birmingham, a city where Leave won, but by the smallest of margins in the 2016 referendum. Now, Channel 4 has conducted the biggest and deepest independent survey on Brexit with the polling company Survation, asking over 20,000 people drawn from every constituency across the nations of the United Kingdom. In the next hour, we'll reveal what the UK thinks of Brexit and the likely outcome of a new referendum were it held today. We're joined by an audience from across the region, evenly split between Leavers and Remainers, and a few who don't know. I'll be speaking to key players, the Justice Secretary, David Gauke, who will be in Cabinet with Theresa May tomorrow, and Barry Gardiner, who, if Labour were in power, would be leading trade negotiations. Now, as individuals, they both voted to remain, but their parties, the only two who have any chance of negotiating Brexit, are both now committed to leaving the EU. Of course, new cross-party Brexit campaigns have sprung up since the referendum on either side, both furious with the government and Labour. Caroline Lucas supports a people's vote, a chance for the UK to think again. And Nigel Farage is back, out campaigning for Leave means leave. Now, what we want to find out tonight is, 2 years on, are people unchanged in their views or beginning to think afresh? Rick, have you changed your mind?
I have, yes. The vote was tight, but it was a surprise to those of us who voted to remain the first time round. But the people want to leave, so I'm on board with that. Let's get behind it, let's get the best deal we can.
Shirley, how about you?
I voted Leave originally. I still vote Leave. I've analysed all the different facets that have been going on.
But is it clear to you?
I don't think it's really going to be clear to anybody until a potential decision is made that we can actually work with. At the moment, I would still vote Leave again.
Amanda, I mean, do you hear people saying they've changed their minds?
Not very many. The odd person. I've met two that voted Leave that are now thinking again, but I just think this is a complete omni-shambles, if I'm honest.
And so you're firmer than ever?
Personally,
in your own opinion?
I voted Remain, but I've accepted the Leave decision. I think the referendum should never have happened in the first place. It was a vanity project. Do you think Britain's changed its mind? Any of you? Not sure, not sure. Well, we will find out. Now, on the night of June the 23rd, 2016, the first indicator that a political earthquake was about to hit Britain was the referendum result from Sunderland. Now, Sunderland voted Leave by 61% to 39% that night. So what does our survey suggest they feel now? It's shifted a lot by 10 points. Now it's 49% Remain and 51% Leave. So still a majority for Leave, but much, much tighter. Now only a couple of percent in it. Now we'll bring you results from other areas and reveal what the UK as a whole thinks later on in the programme. But Sir John Curtis, familiar face, is head of the UK Polling Council, and he's always on those election night programmes and the referendum night programmes. You were there when the Sunderland result came in and everybody went, oh my goodness.
Yeah,
what does that mean?
It wasn't a surprise that Sunderland voted Leave. Everybody expected Sunderland to vote Leave, frankly, even if the country had voted narrowly to remain. The surprise was the size of the margin. That margin suggested, if the rest of the country was going to follow Sunderland, that perhaps Leave had narrowly won it. Now, of course, what we now see here is a big swing back. The question that faces us in the next hour, is that equally indicative of what the rest of the country thinks? Or perhaps has our survey revealed that this time at least, Sunderland has swung rather differently from the rest of the country?
If you'd have seen that result back in 2016, what would you have said will happen?
Back in 2016, if we'd seen 59-51 in Sunderland, we would have been thinking that probably Remain were home and dry. But of course, there's always variation, so we could by no means have been sure simply on that evidence alone.
A lot of scepticism about opinion polls these days. Tell us about this one and what has been done to it, to the numbers, to make it reliable.
Yeah, there are two things about this poll that are crucial. The first is the size. This is the biggest poll to be commissioned by a non-partisan organisation since the EU referendum. And because of its size, we can tell you much more about both who is now inclined to vote Leave and Remain, because we have lots of people in the various demographic and political groups, but also crucially, as we've just illustrated, we can also give you an idea of how each local authority voted. We can, in this sense, replicate the referendum account of 2016. We have sufficient people that the data have been analysed and modelled so that we can come up with an estimate for everywhere of how we think the country might vote if we were to have another referendum.
Sir John Curtis, thank you. Nigel Farage, that comes up 49-51. Sweaty seat of the pants time?
2 points to make. First, the sample size is tiny. It may be big nationally, but within Sunderland, it's fewer than 200 people. And I would not take any poll seriously that wasn't at least 1,000 people per constituency, point one. Point two...
Well, you can dismiss the poll, but it is the biggest one since the referendum.
Well, nationally, yes, but not... If I wanted to see what Sunderland thought, there'd be at least 1,000 people in Sunderland. Second point is this. People respond to campaigning. You know, the reason at election time that we knock on doors and deliver leaflets and do things is people respond to it. What we've been through now for the last 6-9 months is a Remain campaign, very heavily funded, very active, out there everyday campaigning, out with their street stalls. And frankly, the big problem that the Leave campaigners had, and okay, we've tried with Leave Means Leave to get it going again, is we thought we'd won, well, we had won, we thought the general election was the second vote in favour of Leave, and we've not been out there. Okay. So I would expect across the country to see a move back in the other direction, but not of that scale.
Caroline Lucas, are you cheered by this? I mean, how big does the move need to be to deliver your people's vote or to stop the whole thing?
Well, I think this is a very positive vote coming from Sunderland. You know, as John Curtis said, it was a place that had such a big majority in favour of Leave before. The fact that we're now pretty much neck and neck, I think, is pretty positive. And it's interesting to hear Nigel, you know, trying to find reasons for why this is happening. But I can tell you why it's happening.
He's got a point, hasn't he? I mean, he's got a full-on campaign.
I think it was Amanda over there who basically called what's happening from the government omni-shambles. It is an omni-shambles. I don't blame Theresa May. She's basically been held hostage by the zealots in her own government who want to have this very ideological extreme Brexit. She is being given a position that is impossible to square. So she's being told that we've got to leave the single market and the customs union, but not have a hard border in Ireland. Now, those two things are impossible to resolve, and that's why it's so important that it goes back to the people, that we have a people's vote on the final outcome so we can see what people really think.
Well, you take us very well, then, to what we wanted to have a look at next, because the government are currently still in negotiations with the EU about what they want from a deal. If you believe them, 95% of it's been agreed. But what is it that the public want? We asked the nation what were the key things that they did or did not want to see in a final deal. Now, we asked whether, after Brexit, people would be happy with a deal which limits the UK's ability to make trade deals with countries outside the EU, something that you cannot do and remain in the customs union. Now, only 19% agree with that, while 62% disagree. So there is very strong support for the idea of Britain being able to do its own trade deals. One red line the government have always insisted on has been an end to freedom of movement. Immigration, they think, was a key driver for Brexit. But what do the people think now? We asked whether after Brexit, UK and EU citizens who wish to do so should be able to live and work in each other's countries. And this one's a surprise. 63% agree with that. That's 63% of people effectively agreeing with freedom of movement after Brexit. 20% disagree. That's people. That is people. The question. The question that was asked was if people want to. So you can dismiss it if you like, but let's look at both those areas. First, people clearly want a degree of freedom of movement, according to that poll, and that's what neither of you are offering at the moment. David Gork, are you surprised by that number?
Yes, yes, I am, and that doesn't reflect the opinions that you get on the doorstep, talking to members of the public. And I speak as someone who, as you mentioned, campaigned, voted to remain, but it seemed to me in 2016 a very strong message from the British public was that freedom of movement was something that they wanted to address. And I think even a number of people who voted Remain felt that the way freedom of movement was working was not what they wanted. So well, I'm very surprised
Barry
by that.
Gardner, could it be something to do with the way you ask a question?
Yeah.
If you ask people, would you think we should all be able to live and work in each other's countries across Europe? They like the idea of that. If you talk about immigrants having free movement into Britain, then they don't.
Well, look, I'm heartened by the response. But what we've always said is that what you should do is you should set your immigration policy to meet the needs of your economy. The mistake the government has always made is to set their economic policy to meet arbitrary immigration targets.
But you want to end freedom of movement, don't you?
Freedom of movement ends when you leave the EU. And what we've said is we want to have an immigration policy that is for the benefit of jobs, for the benefit of our economy. Now, the problem that the government has got is they promised a white paper on this 18 months ago. They still haven't delivered it. And what David needs to be able to answer is, by the 29th of March next year, will we actually have a new Immigration Act setting out what the rules are? Because the Immigration Minister came before the Select Committee last week and she didn't know, and the department had to contradict her afterwards.
In terms of the migration position we will have, it depends on whether we reach a deal or not. The intention is to reach a deal where there'll be an implementation period. But yeah, we want to change our immigration system so that it is based not on which country you come from, but what you bring to the country.
Doesn't sound like we've got a new system by March, though, does it?
Well, the intention is to have a deal so that we will have an implementation period, and then at the end of that, at the end of the implementation period, we've got the
David,
time
you'll
to
only
put
get
in
a
place
deal
the
if you know what you want, and at the moment, the Cabinet doesn't know what it wants.
Well, look, the politicians here all seem gobsmacked by the numbers on that wall, that so many people seem to agree with the idea of living and working in each other's countries across Europe. Pam Connolly, are you surprised by that?
Not at all. From the reading that I've done recently, it comes as no surprise, because I think both Remainers and Leavers have a certain degree of sympathy and compassion and willingness for freedom of movement.
Simon Bradley, where are you? Simon, what do you think?
Well, we voted to leave the European Union, and that was one of the reasons why I voted to leave. So,
freedom of movement?
Yeah, and I think we should still leave, and that needs to be part of it. Stop the freedom of movement.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, what about those trade figures? I mean, people clearly want to be able to set their own trade deals. Isn't that incompatible with staying in the customs union, David Gork, which is what your fallback is looking like?
Well, no, it's not. And our objective, our intention is to be able to enter into trade deals, just as that question suggests. So we need to have the ability to do that. We also need to ensure that we don't put up trade barriers with the European Union, that we have frictionless trade, and that is something which is a key objective of our negotiations.
But if we stay in the customs union, we are not free to do trade deals, are we?
Well, no, our intention is not to stay in the customs union. Our intention is to leave the customs union.
When?
There's an issue, well, as soon as we are able to do so, with having sorted out the Northern Ireland border. And that is our objective. And that's what's happening now with the negotiations, so we can deal with that issue and then go on and enter into trade agreements with other parts of the world.
Barry Gardner, you're no better off here, are you?
Well, look, what we've said is that we believe there should be a customs union, and actually we were saying that a long time ago, and the government's now trying to catch up with its customs arrangement.
Extremely unattractive.
No, that was the Turkish option. Read it properly.
Customs union was extremely unattractive.
What we've said is that we would want a new customs union. The problem for David and the Conservatives is that they've locked themselves into the existing customs union arrangements in the transition period at least, and then in perpetuity until they sort out the Northern Ireland question. What we said is we want a new customs union in which the UK would have a say in any new deals that were done. That would mean, just like they do in Mercosur and other customs unions around the world. So we would not be a rule taker, and that's the way that our proposal respects the referendum result, respects the fact that people have said they want to take back control, and that's the difference. And we say that that should be in perpetuity because it sorts out the just-in-time supply chain.
Let me bring
all of our jobs, and particularly the jobs in Sunderland that you mentioned, depend on.
Let me bring in
the
Nina
automotive industry, it's absolutely critical.
Who has advised European governments on Brexit policy. Does this make sense? Will Europe go for this, where we have a customs deal with the European Union and we're allowed to do our own deals?
As far as the EU's position is concerned, it's quite clear that does not fly. If the UK is in the customs union, or a customs union, it's simply semantics. The UK cannot have its own independent trade policy if it is in the EU's customs union. The problem, of course, is it's not clear how to solve the quandary that's been dogging everyone in these negotiations of the Irish border without either there being a border in the Irish Sea or the entire UK remaining in the customs union, at least for a short period of time.
Well, the really interesting thing about this poll was how much support there was for Theresa May's position on this idea of checks on goods. Let's have a look at that graphic. All political parties in the public seem united in not wanting special checks on goods. If you ask them whether they want goods checks across the Irish Sea, there we are, 45% disagree. Why is the European Union, Nina Schick, still sticking to this?
It's not a question of EU intransigence, it's simply a question of the rules. Now, the UK has said, we're leaving the customs union and we're leaving the single market. So the EU has to have checks on its external border. That happens to be on the island of Ireland. Now, everyone, Ireland, the EU, the UK, agrees that there can be no checks, there are no border. So where do you put the border, given that the technology to have a frictionless border does not yet exist? The EU has said, we'll put it in the Irish Sea. The British government says that is not permissible. Any British government cannot accept that. So therefore, the only conclusion that I see that's viable, and I think the EU's position is clear on this right now, is that the entire UK remains in the customs union, at least for a period until the technology is developed to square this circle.
John, what can you tell us about the public's red lines?
Well, I think what we've learned from this is that how you describe the red lines can make a very big difference to the answer you get. So on Ireland, we were talking about should there be checks. That doesn't sound very nice. On trade, we talked about being limitations on what the UK can do. That doesn't sound very nice. On the other hand, when it came to freedom of movement, we said, well, look, should people be able to free to go and live in each other's countries? And people said, okay, that sounds fine. I think the crucial lesson, therefore, by a lot of these red lines is that particularly when the deal is done, assuming there is a deal, how it gets sold and how it gets described could well be crucial. And I think those on both sides of the fence will need to think hard about whether or not the red lines on which the UK government have insisted are necessarily ones on which the public insist, or whether they are ones where the public can be persuaded to accept them so long as they are presented in an attractive light.
Right. How do we all think Theresa May has handled these negotiations? Sean, how do you think she's done?
Pretty badly.
Why?
Because there's too much uncertainty and we don't know what to do. Businesses do not
That's
know
not her
what to
fault,
do.
is it?
Well, the reality is, if you set the clock ticking and enter into negotiation where you have a weaker hand, how is it going to go well? Of course it's not going to go well. And the reality is, for businesses like me, you know, my customers are in the EU, my supply chain is in the EU, and I have EU-based competitors selling the same product. If there's any chance of a border, customs delays, tariffs, I'm going to be uncompetitive, and they're going to steal my business, and I will cease to exist.
Rhys, what do you make of the way Theresa May has handled this?
I mean, I think she's in a rock and a hard place. Yes, she's made bad decisions by going in with the DUP. Obviously, that has politicised the Irish question. But I think we need to ask a larger question. If Theresa May was a man, I think she would not get as much stick as she's getting right now. I think she gets a lot of stick for being a female. I think the problem is that she has, her cabinet are split between Leave and Remain. She has to be in between that. She has to deal with the DUP. She is probably, although I'm not a Conservative, she is trying her best, I would say, in most regards.
Molly, you were saying rubbish.
Well, Theresa May should be accorded the respect of being judged equally. Whether you're a man or a woman in that role, you have a duty to deliver the Leave vote. The red lines are very clear. It was, we want to be able to be regulatorily diverge from the European Union. Chequers doesn't allow that. We want to have control of the immigration policy. Chequers does not appear to allow that. We will still have ECJ oversight. It's very disrespectful, and the euphemistic language in Chequers is very problematic because it creates distrust. It does what people have been mistrustful of all along. With Maastricht, with Lisbon, it was only the consequences of those things became clear 5 years, 10 years down the line.
OK, well, we did ask... We did ask what you make of other people who could negotiate this deal. So when it came to Jeremy Corbyn, only 24% thought he would do better than the Prime Minister, and 45% said he'd do worse. The darling of the hardline Tory Brexiteers, Boris Johnson, well, he does even worse. Look at that. 22% saying better, 46% worse. And, well, he's over there, Nigel Farage, the consistent voice of Brexit. Only 23% think Nigel would have done a better job, and 48% think it would do worse. Well, not much confidence in you, Nigel.
Well, I tell you what, there'd be no confusion, because what we're getting here is a Remainers Brexit. Theresa May never believed in it. She's watered it down, delayed it. She's prepared to pay over vast sums of money. The Labour Party are no better. I mean, you know, Barry, you talked about Brexit meaning leaving the customs union, leaving the single market. Well, you've changed your tune on that. And I think the biggest problem we've got here is a lack of leadership. People are very confused out there in the country. If you ask in your questions...
Well, but all these great leaders, everyone talks about Boris Johnson being a great leader. Well, nobody wants him.
Well, I'm not sure anyone knows what to think right now. If you ask people, do you want to make your own laws? Do you want to control your own borders? Do you want to make your own trade deals? You get big majorities saying yes. So in its heart, the country still wants Brexit. I'm afraid it's becoming very disenchanted with politics and politicians.
Caroline Lucas.
I think what these votes show you is the fact that we are now discovering just how complex and costly Brexit is going to be in a way we didn't know 2 years ago. And when it comes to the issue of trade, there is no trade deal in the world that will replace what we already have with the EU. That's 44% of our trade is with the EU now, plus another 17% if you add in all of those countries, another 65 countries with whom the EU has trade deals. The idea that having new trade deals with Australia or India or Indonesia or the US could possibly substitute for that is completely wrong. We know that we would lose around 5% of our growth if we came out of the single market and replaced it with only 0.7% by those other trade deals.
Our survey tells us something quite alarming about the state of British politics, in that people don't agree with Theresa May's deal, and they think all the options are awful as well.
Well, I agree with you. There is something wrong with our politics, which is why we need to go back to the people so that they have a say. But in the meantime, I think we need to be listening to what that survey told us about things like freedom of movement as well. I think that the people now have seen through the kind of rhetoric from Nigel and others who told us that the problem to all of our, the problem behind all of our issues was to do with migration. We now know that public services are crumbling because of a lack of investment from successive governments, and they are not going to be stopped from getting into the NHS by a migrant. You're far more likely to find a migrant treating you in the NHS than you are to find them in front of you.
Well, in a moment, we'll find out how the nation would vote in an in-out referendum today. But first, we wanted to find out how people think Brexit will impact on their lives. Now, on the economy overall, only 35% of people think it will have a good impact. More, 49%, think the impact on the economy overall in Britain will be bad. But what about ourselves, our own households? When it comes to household finances, what do we think about that? Well, only 18% of people think Brexit will be good for their household finances, and 44% think it will be bad for them, with 38% saying it will make no difference. Let's see what some of our guests today here feel. Sharon, what do you think Brexit's going to mean for your household?
well, it isn't just my household, it's the city as a whole. I come from Stoke-on-Trent, and the majority were to leave. But they voted to leave because they were railroaded into the wrong decision. They were misled. And the people of Stoke-on-Trent obviously didn't realise that voting to leave could have a big impact on their industry.
Did you think that?
Yeah, because the industry, it'll take a big hit because most of the production of the pot trees is export, a large percentage. So when the Brexit does go through, we need free trade, because what will happen is, if we don't, it can kill a city.
What do you think Brexit's going to do?
If I'm going to be truly honest, I kind of don't believe it will make a difference, if I'm going to be honest. I compare it to, like, the recession. And when everyone was saying the country's in a recession, when we come out of a recession, things are going to get better. We're supposed to be out of recession. And for me, I haven't really seen the difference.
Well, you're saying that because you feel you've got nothing to lose?
Nah, I've definitely got a lot to lose, if I'm going to be honest. But I'm saying the difference between the recession, for me, then personally, the difference between when there was a recession and when we suddenly came out of the recession, I didn't see it. So I kind of look at this as being the same thing. I think it's going to make more of an impact on politicians, bankers, and big businesses than the little people in the communities.
How about you? I mean, there is not a lot of confidence that Brexit is going to be good for the economy.
I can't see how it will be. Well, I work for an organisation called Beat Freaks, which provides platforms for young people in the city. And I don't think that they've been taken into account at all. People like Nigel, I don't think that you've ever moved out of your own experience to have a conversation with anybody else to see how it might impact you and how the things that you're saying are going to impact people in the city. Birmingham is home to more small and medium-sized enterprises than any other city outside of London. We've got the highest youth population outside, we've got the highest youth population in Europe as well. I feel like it's going to be a problem for jobs, it's going to be a problem for supply lines, and ultimately it's going to be bad for future generations in this city.
OK, thank you. John Curtis, do these views on the economy matter? Do they change people's views?
These views undoubtedly matter. There's nothing more clearly a subject on which Remain and Leave voters disagree than on the economic consequences of Brexit. Around 4 in 5 Remain voters think it's going to be bad for the economy, but around 2/3 of Leave voters think it's going to be good, and many of the Remainers simply say it won't make much difference. And there's no other subject on which they disagree more, and there is, by the way, no other subject that, insofar as people have changed their minds since 2 years ago, there's no other subject that seems to encourage people to change their minds than if they change their views about the economic consequences of Brexit. So the economic debate is absolutely crucial, but notice that even now, apparently only around a half of the country actually think it's going to be bad. This is still a subject on which we are very seriously divided, much as we were 2 years ago.
But are people prepared to say, I think it's going to be bad for the economy, but I still want it?
There aren't very many. As I already said to you, around 2/3 of Leave voters think it's going to be good for the economy, and most of the remaining 1/3 say it just won't make any difference. The crucial thing you need to understand there, no difference is code for it will be all right on the night.
David Gork, people are right to be worried about the economy, aren't they?
It depends on the nature of our departure. If we leave on no-deal terms, there's no good shying away. It will be very bad for us economically.
But even with a deal, will we be better off with a deal than we are now economically inside the European Union?
Well, if we can get a good deal, and that means removing
let's say you
all
get
the frictions,
Theresa May's deal.
the Chequers-type deal, so we don't have friction with trade, then economically, I don't think it's going to make a particular big difference.
So we won't be better off?
I'm not arguing that we will. I just don't think it'll be that big an impact.
So we will be worse off, but just a bit worse off?
I think.
I think statistics show that we're going to be worse off. Every single scenario that you tried to hide with your impact assessments, every single one of them showed the country worse off.
Let him finish.
The British people made a decision to leave the European Union. You can make a simple case, well, they got it wrong and so on, but I think that would be very dangerous, very damaging to our political stability. You can also make an argument, well, British people have voted to leave and we'll just get on with it and it doesn't matter what we do, we just get on and leave. And you know, Nigel can make that case and there's a lot of clarity. But there are economic risks in doing that, which is why the government has to try to square this circle of trying to get the best deal economically for us, protect jobs and livelihoods, whilst also clearly leaving the European Union.
Gardner, will you say the British people will be worse off after Brexit than they are now?
Let me be clear. Both David and I said before the referendum that we would be worse off. So there's no point in pulling out of that.
So you still think that?
We said that. I still believe that economically we are likely to be worse off. That is, but of course economics is not the only thing that matters. People were also voting in the referendum about whether they wanted ever closer union in the EU and other political matters. But that's why what we've done in saying that we will respect the result of the referendum, even though I still believe that we will be worse off economically, we've said we have to mitigate that damage, and that is why a new customs union that solves the just-in-time supply chain, that actually meets the issue of that 44% of exports that Caroline was talking about, that's why making sure that those jobs are protected, the economy is protected as much as possible is the important way of doing this that can begin to try and reunite the 52 and the 48%.
But you are both united in saying tonight this is an act of economic self-harm.
I've said that for a long time. I said it before, I say it since. But I do say that the British people gave us a mandate to do otherwise, and that's why we respect it.
But Barry, the biggest single economic risk is if we don't get a deal. Now, if the Prime Minister comes back with a deal, and we haven't got a deal yet, but if she comes back with a deal that is actually on the table, not a fantasy deal, a deal is on the table, will the Labour Party vote it down and risk a no deal? Because that would be an act of economic self-harm.
David, the idea that after the incompetence that your government has shown over the past 2 years in these negotiations, that you come back and say, well, I know we've messed it up. I know we've messed it up, but this is all we could do and get it through the cabinet. Therefore, you've got to vote for that or no deal. I
want to get to some more results.
That is a ludicrous suggestion.
Because we also asked if people thought Brexit would be good for levels of immigration. Now, good is in the eye of the beholder, of course, but 45% of people think Brexit will be good for immigration, 24% of people think it will be bad, and 31%, nearly 1 in 3, think it will make no difference at all. Now, 42% of people also think immigration more generally has had a positive impact on Britain, and that's a very significant result because it's changed a lot over the years. 42% think immigration is positive. Let's go back 5 years to 2013. Only 26% of people used to say that immigration was positive, and 56% said it was negative. John Curtis, what does it mean?
Well, there are two things to take together there. The first, indeed, this is not the first survey to show that in the last couple of years or so, attitudes towards immigration have become more favourable. That said, notice how sceptical the public were about immigration 5 years ago. We've simply got back on the evidence of this poll to a situation where we're pretty evenly divided as to whether we think immigration is a good thing or a bad thing or not. But to go back to your first resort, this is the one subject on which Leave voters are most convinced. Over 70% of them think that Brexit will be good for immigration, and meanwhile Remain voters frankly aren't terribly sure. So that's why you end up with this very clear majority of saying it's going to be good, Brexit's going to be good for immigration. It's again a subject which clearly sings above all to the hearts of Leave voters.
Nina Schick, I mean, things are going the other way in Europe though, aren't they?
Make no mistake about it, immigration is one of the most important issues across the European continent. However, there's an important caveat and distinction to make about the debate in European countries and the debate that was had here. The kind of sentiment that you see towards immigration in the European countries has to do with non-EU immigration. It has a lot to do with the migration crisis, the asylum crisis, of which in 2015, the UK did not have to accept EU asylum seekers and migrants. It is not about free movement of people. It is not about the right of other EU citizens to live, travel, and work freely in other EU countries. But immigration, per se, is going to be one of the most defining issues in European politics in the years to come.
Right, well, Birmingham is one of the most diverse cities in the UK. Let's talk to some of you from here. Elena, where are you? Elena, I mean, how has the post-Brexit debate affected the way you feel in this country?
Unwelcome, quite simply. I'm an European citizen. I've been here for 10 years out of 36 of my life.
Have you noticed that change?
Yes. When I came here for the first time when I was 16, I felt very welcome. And as a consequence, I chose to move back when I was 30. I quit my job in Germany and moved over here. And I was happy until the referendum. And since then, fundamentally, people have been very negative about migration. They don't distinguish, as the lady just said, between EU and non-EU migration. The government has been rather unforthcoming in securing our rights. Theresa May has said, and the devil is in the detail, we will broadly and purely broadly secure EU citizens' rights, and we still have no system to register or any actual documentation with which our rights will be secured in writing.
What do you make of those figures that show people are much more positive about immigration?
Well, we are from the restaurant sector, voted to leave with the hope that we'll get a fair immigration and recruitment system for the survival of our businesses. When we come to recruitment, there's a law for minimum wage if you are recruiting from Europe. There is another law and policies if you are recruiting outside Europe.
Well, do you think you did the right thing?
We have done the right thing as long as the government's attitudes change. It is it belongs up to the government to make sure that we have the right Brexit policies and we have a fair Brexit policies that will help our restaurant industries.
Stuart, you're a farmer, aren't you?
I am indeed, yeah.
So, I mean, what do you make of how Britain feels about immigration and immigrants?
Well, I think one of the things that some of the language that's been used historically has been very hostile, and I think one of the things we see in our sector is actually migrant labour, whether that be seasonal or permanent labour, is absolutely critical to our sector, but it hasn't been valued because of some of the hostile language used by a minority of people, and we have got to have a plan. We are sat here at the moment where there is fruit and veg being left unpicked, fresh fruit and veg being left unpicked, factories in the food industry working short weeks because we are already seeing the effects of this because of that hostile environment. And we have got to get to a point where we value the migrant labour and we value everyone in society.
Harriet?
I think that the EU promotes freedom of movement of white Westerners, and I think when we leave the EU, we can open up our borders to people from all over the world. You know, there's places where there's surplus of nurses. We need more nurses. Why are we prioritising people from Europe? I think we leave the EU, we open up the borders, we can let in more refugees, more asylum seekers. I don't see the problem with immigration at all. But I think the real problem is not politics, it's the hostile environment they face.
OK. Nigel Farage, are you feeling a little out of touch with this?
Funny, isn't it? On the one hand, we're being told Brexit has made people hostile towards migrants. On the other, we're told we're more relaxed about it. You can't have it both ways. The truth of it is, ridiculous. The truth of it is, the reason those figures have changed is a big chunk of the electorate think the immigration issue's been dealt with because we voted Brexit, and they think our major political parties will carry out their wishes. Actually, the penny's not yet dropped, that there is no intention from this government or this opposition to deal with open-door immigration. So we, at the moment, are in a holding zone. If you look across the rest of Europe, it is the issue that is completely redefining European politics.
Or maybe when you said it was breaking point with those posters, it wasn't.
Well, it's broken virtually everything, hasn't it? Look at Italy. It's broken Italian politics so completely you can't believe it. It's led to Viktor Orban now having 2/3 of seats in the Hungarian parliament. And right across Europe, there is a radical change that is taking place. And I think, you know, it's funny, we also talk about economics. Let's just remember, folks, it's the European Union that has destroyed the prospects economically of tens of millions of young people living in the Mediterranean. And you know, there is one big point here. We can talk economics, we can talk immigration. We're missing the most important point tonight. We voted to leave. We were asked in a general election to back two parties who said they'd honour it. We voted for it again, and now they're betraying all of us. That's the real point about this debate tonight.
Let's see what people think. Caroline Lucas.
To suggest that it's the fault of the EU as an institution that we saw those horrendous pictures of migrants being turned away is absolutely wrong. It was the fault of individual EU governments. That is not the same as the EU institutions. The Commission, the European Parliament were doing their best to actually be far more compassionate.
Are you sure if I mean, Nigel Farage said it at the beginning, we haven't had them campaigning and making these arguments that he's making tonight. If we have all of this again, if we unleash this again, are you sure this is still where public opinion is going to be?
I think, even if I wasn't sure, I think it is the democratic thing to do. So I think it's the right thing to do, irrespective of the fact that if it happens, I will be fighting very hard for us to remain. Because you've just heard the most extraordinary thing from Barry. I love Barry. But the idea that we have to commit, what he says, is an act of economic harm, because it's the will of the people, and the Labour Party won't go back and just check with the will of the people before you actually do something that's going to massively hurt them. That seems to be
Absolutely not.
Right. Let's get on.
Christian, no. Caroline knows very well, and this was concluded at our party conference recently, so it's not old news, right? Knows very well that we've said that if Theresa May cannot secure a majority in Parliament, we would call for a general election, but if we don't get a general election, we would then say that it then has to go back to the people.
We will come back to this.
You can't say that we've ruled that out. We have not.
Let's get to the big number. Let's get to the big result. We have heard the public red lines for the Brexit negotiations and how they feel about leaving the EU and how it's likely to impact on their lives. Let's get to our big question. Survation analysed the responses of 20,000 voters from every constituency across the UK, the largest independent survey conducted on Brexit since the referendum. Now, we asked the same question as was asked back in 2016. Should the UK remain in the European Union or leave the European Union? And the result is, we're in. Well, there you are. 54% would vote to remain today. 46% would vote to leave. It would appear a clear majority now in favour of staying in the EU. And let's have a look at how the country has changed geographically. Now, that's how things looked back in 2016. You'll see the blue areas are leave, the yellow are remain. You see Scotland, Northern Ireland, some of the metropolitan cities are remain. The rest is blue. Let's have a look at it today. It is transformed. Look at that. Wales has gone remain. The southwest has gone remain. Whole swathes of the northeast. Let's just go back. Let's have a look at that change again. That's what it was in 2016. And today, that is quite a dramatic change. Barry Gardner, are you on the right side?
Yes, because I think what you've shown is our nation continues to be incredibly divided. You've now said 56, 40, 44. We remain an incredibly divided nation. And actually, going back and doing another referendum, you may get that result. What you would have is you would have increased those divides enormously. And that's what I find deeply troubling about this.
David Gork, a quick reaction to this.
But that's why there is a way of respecting the referendum, and that is what we put forward in terms of a new customs union. That's what we put forward. Jeremy actually made the offer to Theresa May.
Let's just get a reaction to these numbers. David Gork.
Look, I have to say, until we got to the last bit, I agree with Barry on this, I'm afraid, that a decision was made. We are, of course, at the sort of end of a negotiation, at a period where we all have to accept a lot of uncertainty. And at this point, I have to say, not at all surprised that there's been a swing back to remain. I think if we get a deal, then there could well be a swing back to leave. If we don't get a deal, then I suspect there'll be a further swing to remain. But just at this point, you know, public opinion will move around, but we had a referendum.
Well, it's gone the other way.
We all
John
said
Curtis,
we'd respect that result.
John Curtis, unpick this for us.
Well, I think it's important to understand what lies underlying this movement. What does not underlie this movement is many voters changing their minds. Of the 6% swing or so that we see to Remain as compared with 2016, only about 1% is the result of the fact that Leave voters are slightly more likely to say they'd vote Remain than Remain voters are likely to vote to Leave. What lies behind this actually is an awful lot to do with turnout. The biggest element are those people who did not vote in 2016, who in this survey, like many other surveys, are around 2 to 1 in favour of Remain. Now, of course, many of these people are young people. Around 57% of the people who did not vote in 2016 are under 35. So therefore, it won't also surprise you to hear that one of the other things this poll shows underneath the news of this is that the swing towards Remain has been strongest amongst younger voters. It's virtually absent amongst older voters. So to that extent, at least, that age divide does indeed now look to be wider. But there's one other thing, however, to understand, which is also which is interesting, which is that the swing towards Leave, away from Leave, seems to have been greatest in those places that were most heavily in favour of Leave in 2016.
So there is some constituencies.
So there is, it's the local authority areas that, like Sunderland that we saw earlier, that were most pro-Leave, that seem to have swung back most.
Caroline Lucas. This isn't big enough for you, is it? It's just not decisive enough.
It's not the end of the story, but what I want to say is that what we need to be doing is recognising as well that many of the people who voted Leave had legitimate grievances, very legitimate grievances that need to be tackled. So the People's Vote campaign isn't just saying, let's just swap and see if we can get, you know, a vote like this and just change the balance. What we're saying is we need to look at those underlying reasons that drove people to feel so fed up and so angry with the establishment. The fact that they haven't been able to get their kids into local schools. The fact that the NHS has been crumbling because successive governments have failed to invest in it. So I simply want to say that I think it's massively important that the People's Vote campaign and all of us who want to see the opportunity for the people to have a say recognise that it's not about turning the clock back for 2 years. Just one point, but it's not about turning the clock back 2 years. It's about saying, let us make sure that we address those underlying reasons that drove so many people to feel that the only solution was to leave the EU, when in fact leaving the EU will make things worse.
When we looked at voter turnout, only 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds say they will definitely vote in another referendum. That is the same percentage who voted in 2016. There isn't a great activation of young people who want to overturn Brexit.
I do find that figure really surprising, because we've seen the wonderful campaigns by Our Future, Our Choice. We've seen the fact that the 700,000 people marching through London a couple of weeks ago were led by young people. But Brexit is the biggest act of intergenerational betrayal that you could come across. And young people are rightly hugely angry that their futures are the ones that are being put at stake on this.
Do you respect public opinion?
Given we have a government that doesn't believe in Brexit, and we make the arguments for it, given that you've got just the Remain argument, I mean, look at this room. There's a room full of Remainers.
No,
just me.
it's not. It's absolutely not.
On the panel, Remain.
Brexit,
all right?
Brexit.
So, 4 Remainers.
Brexit.
They voted Remain.
Yes, but they are both in favour of Brexit.
No, but they're not making the Brexit arguments. You have not heard the Brexit argument made for the last 18 months, and we're still on 46%. If the democratic will of the people is overturned and betrayed, and they force us to vote again, I'm convinced from those figures, Leave would win by a much bigger margin next time.
We're going to give the last words again to the people. Mathamwi Carville, what do you make of that?
Oh, he's just talking rubbish again, aren't you, Nigel? I live 20 minutes away from the Northern Irish border. I understand exactly what's going to happen if your unfortunate project goes ahead, and it's not going to be pretty. Let's look at this survey, let's go for the people's vote, and let's focus on the real things that are at hand, happening in this country right now, which is the underfunding of the NHS, the underfunding of the police service, the fact that Northern Ireland don't have a government. It's ridiculous.
I think these results are really a barometer of
the difficulty surrounding the negotiations at the moment. I think people feel a bit of a lack of confidence, a bit of confusion about where we are, and I think that these statistics represent that. But I think that, look, the public made their call on this some time ago, and they did so for some really valid reasons, and I think those reasons remain. Okay. I'm still positive that...
Thank you. Look, one of the astonishing things as that map went was Wales went Remain. So Scotland is Remain, Northern Ireland is Remain, Wales is Remain. You know what, from our results tonight, England has gone Remain as well. How do you bring the country together now? This is a mess.
It's the right question, because we do have to bring the country together. And 2 years ago, we had a narrow victory for Leave. On this survey, a narrow, Remain are ahead, relatively narrowly. We have got to find a way of coming together as a country, which means rejecting the sort of simple answers, that there's an easy way that you can just do this, that you can just walk through it and it'll all be fine, because that isn't the real world. It is a complicated negotiation. It will require compromises from us and from the European Union, and if we can deliver a deal that respects the referendum result but protects jobs and livelihoods and keeps the United Kingdom a United Kingdom, then we are doing what the public needs us to do.
Does this make any difference to a second Scotland independence referendum?
It doesn't. In the survey, we find almost as many yes voters who say they would now be less likely to vote yes as a result of Brexit as we find no voters move in the opposite direction. So there's no obvious evidence that Scotland would vote differently in an independence referendum than the way it did back in 2014.
Barry Gardiner, are you definitely not going to change your mind? You know, your party now is overwhelmingly Remain. 70% of Labour voters, according to this survey, back Remain.
Christian, we are a democratic party, right? And that means we must respect democracy. We gave the people the opportunity in that referendum to reach a conclusion. We campaigned against it. We said that we didn't think it was the right course economically for our country to go down. We've tried to respect that, but what we've done at every stage, is we've tried to bring the 52 and the 48 back closer together. We continue to do that in the proposals that we have put forward to Theresa May about how she could get a deal through Parliament.
I'm so sorry we're out of time,
but we
could have gone on all night. We've got to leave it
referendum.
there. Thank you. All of the results are online tonight. You can go to the Channel 4 News website to see them. Thank you to everyone here and to all of you for watching. For now, good night.